leaders. You are the essence of any recovery process, and I think it's so helpful to be both doing preparatory work for anything that might happen in the future, but also maybe thinking in terms of disasters about COVID-19 and the isolation and what we're going through at the moment. Nobody much knows about what happens in a pandemic because we're going through our first one in living memory. I don't know if anyone's read about the 1918 flu, but some very interesting material there. But what I wanted to do was to share with you some of the observations I'm making in the groups that I work with, various groups of service providers, mental health workers, welfare workers, and various other groups, education, talking about the effect of isolation on themselves and their clients, whoever they happen to be working with. And what's particularly important is how does that impact on any community recovery process. This is a big issue for bushfire affected communities at the moment. But in effect, it's important really to go to the fundamental principles of disasters before we start to look at COVID-19 as an example of that. I always start off by mentioning that I began working with disasters as a member of a children's hospital team visiting the Macedon area after Ash Wednesday. And I visited that area for 4 years and saw the recovery cycle unfold. But I didn't really know what I was seeing until I started visiting the Maryborough area halfway through that time, where there was another fire 2 years later. Visiting two communities that were 2 years apart in their recovery process enabled me to sort of look beyond the specifics of each situation to some of the common things that were happening in the communities, start to recognise patterns. And since then I've continued to try and observe and learn about and understand community process and read quite a lot of the research and also a lot of the ideas about what are communities. And I think we start with the fact that a community is a relatively stable collection of people who work, who live and work in relationship to each other. And you have a complex set of relationships amongst your fellow community members where you might feel close to some people in some respects. You might have a similar interest in, I don't know, environment, but you're far apart from others. The people who advocate for coal mines, for instance. I don't know if you have any of them in Surf Coast, but the people who like surfing versus the people who like playing golf. You know, you get to know people in your group. But political interests, occupational interests, sporting interests, whatever. So we actually work out where the people that we're dealing with sit in these many dimensions, and that guides us as to how we deal with them, whether we open up to them or whether we just treat them politely. And so if you wanted to map that, you would map a kind of complex multi-dimensional space in which if you look in one dimension, I'm close to somebody, but if you look in the other dimension, we're actually far apart. You know, like stars look like they're in the one constellation, but the astronomers tell us that this one is 10 light years behind that one, but from our point of view, they look close. And so we live in this complex multi-dimensional social fabric. And what joins us is social bonds, bonds of caring and interest and commonality and so forth. And these bonds are quite strong and stable. And what they give us is a sense of belonging and identity. And most of the time, we're not very aware of this because it works. As long as it works like your knee, as long as your knee works, you don't think about it, do you? Have you ever had a housemaid's knee? You suddenly become excruciatingly conscious of every movement of your knee. So in the same way, anything that's working right fades from our awareness. Now, the real function of this normal community life, to put it simply, is to put survival off the agenda, right? Because we have all sorts of rules and regulations and processes that mean we don't harm each other and so on. And we've got all sorts of specialist agencies to deal with it. We've got fire brigades for fire, we've got ambulance people for heart attacks, we've got plumbers to unblock toilets, and police and so on and so forth. And the rest of us can get on doing whatever we're interested in. So that threats are dealt with until we get a big disaster, which by definition is a threat that has a community-wide impact that can't be dealt with the specialist agencies. We've all got to evacuate because the fire's too big for the fire brigade. And so what happens in the disaster is something impacts on this community structure, which means it becomes immediately irrelevant. All these relationships and complex patterns are suddenly irrelevant in the face of the fire. And the state that people go into is, we could call it the adrenaline state. In the adrenaline state, we've reconfigured for survival. And so we get this incredible, I don't know if you've ever been at this incredible focus, this energy, this fast thinking and action mode. And so if you actually look at that from the social point of view, people drop out of the social system unless you've been trained and done a lot of preparation, and then you'll hold just exactly those relationships that are relevant for dealing with the task. And I call this the moment of debonding. And it's a moment when the old original community structure ceases to exist and everybody improvises around the threat. And this is people evacuating, for instance. Now, debonding doesn't mean like Hollywood movies, we'll all tread on each other's faces to get out. It means people continue to observe basic social values. They help each other if they can. But what determines what they do is the physical opportunity. Most people will do what they can to help anyone who happens to be physically available to be helped, regardless of how well they know them. You know, if it's a complete stranger and they can help them, they'll save their life. And then they'll separate and they haven't even introduced it themselves. These would be stories I've heard. So that there's a tremendous change as long as the threat is looming. As soon as the threat is dealt with and subsides, the fire's out, the flood recedes, then people are in this very heightened state, the threat's gone, but they've fallen out of their normal structure. So what you then get is this massive, heroic search and rescue, helping, volunteerism. If any of you, go back to when Ash Wednesday went through your area, you would remember what it was like afterwards. People sacrifice themselves, they give money, they give their accommodation, they do all sorts of things. So what's driving people is this tremendous energy to help each other, for most people. People don't go back into the complex social fabric because your political interests and your sporting things and whatever other affiliations you had aren't important yet, because those dimensions haven't come into play. So what you get is this close, highly cohesive social unit that's formed entirely devoted for the purpose of relief and recovery. Now, the problem is that this is, I call it the state of fusion. People are very close. After Black Saturday in a little town of Jindavik up in the mountains, they said they formed the Hug Club after the fire went through. The Hug Club consisted of everybody who was in town on the day. Of course, a lot of people had gone on holidays and weren't there, maybe even overseas. But everyone who was there, as soon as they met each other, they hugged. And I was being told this 4 years later when I was up there at a meeting, and I asked the woman who was talking to me, I said, did you know these people beforehand? And she said, not all of them. Some of them I knew by sight. A few of them I knew well, but most of them I didn't, but it didn't matter. We were in the hug club. And then she gestured over to her husband, who was standing nearby drinking a cup of tea, talking to people. She said, but I don't hug him that much. The hug club is only just starting to break down now after 4 years. So it's very hard to describe this intense emotional attachment that forms when you've been through something incredible together. And it's as though it is an independent attachment that doesn't really fit with your relationship for family. And families can become disorganized. I know stories where families make their house available for 18 months for anybody who's in town to drop in, use our house as a staging place, as a drop-in place. And for 18 months, there have been other people in the house. When in fact, during the fire, they got a message from the father to say he was trapped. I love you all. Goodbye. I don't think we're going to make it. And then they don't hear from him for 3 hours. And then eventually he comes back. They're into the finishing up of the fire, and then 18 months of other people in the house. So the family has never spoken about it during this time. They've been totally immersed in the here and now. So 18 months later, there are big problems. The relationships falling apart, the children are traumatized because they haven't actually sat down as a family and processed this huge traumatic moment where they thought for 3 hours they'd lost dad. And so that this fusion, which appears to be so constructive and creative, sows the seeds of a lot of problems because it doesn't permit the right sort of communication. And what you see happening during this, and we've seen it in all sorts of anecdotes about disasters, where this close, highly emotional social unit has indiscriminate communication. And what you get circulating is myths and rumours, and God help us with social media, that all gets going. And whereas in the normal social fabric, we ask, who's saying this? Do they know what they're talking about? Have they got the right to make this announcement? Do they have access to the right information? We have some possibility of processing the information. But in the fusion, you get all of this true and false information, helpful and unhelpful information circulating. And pretty soon, lots of people have an opinion about what other people are getting in the way of relief payments and handouts and assistance of various sorts. And as long as the community remains in this highly emotional state, they're not going to be rational, they're not going to process information in an orderly way. And so the real problem of recovery is, how does the community get from this fusion state, like a plum pudding, back to being a complex social unit with distances and different roles and different relationships? And you can imagine that as time passes, the disaster has affected everyone differently, although the simple idea is that we've all been through the same thing. It's tempting. We've all been through the same thing. Two people who've lost their houses, we've both been through the same thing. But one person's got a brand new house with new furniture and completely well insured, and somebody else is living in an old cottage that's been in their family for 3 generations, and it's full of heirlooms and history and memories. You cannot equate the loss of those houses. One might be worth more than the other financially, but the other is irreplaceable. And then whereas the other one is replaceable. So as time passes and people get down the track and realize what their consequences are, nobody has had the same disaster. Everybody's had a different experience. It's so complex, the nature of the impacts. I've been on the Zoom with people working in bushfire areas, and one person was saying their area wasn't impacted at all. Well, that means nothing was burnt, but I know that people evacuated from that area, and at the time they actually thought the fire was very much closer than it was because they couldn't see what was going on. So they may well have had a very traumatic experience in evacuation, but they've got nothing to show for it. Well, we don't have to have any physical injuries to be traumatized. So now as these differences show up, and you get the differences between the people who are insured and the people who weren't, and the people who lost houses and the people who didn't, any difference you like, those differences create internal tensions. And if we don't understand those tensions and work hard to hold the community together, it starts to tear at those points of connection between the differently affected groups. And I call these cleavage planes. You know, a diamond is a very strong structure, but there are certain planes in the crystal lattice that have weakened molecular bonds. And if you hit the diamond at that plane, it'll split and you'll be able to cut the diamond and make a beautiful gem out of it. Well, I think this fusion has cleavage planes. Some of them might be historical, before the fire and community tensions, and others will be about what happened on the day, who did what and what damage you had. Others will be about the way government gives assistance. That'll create cleavages if we don't do it carefully. And so at the very time you most want the positive sides of this fusion, the support, the communication, the help, the volunteering, the sense of community, the sense of support, at the very time you want that to be maximised, it starts to tear itself apart. And those cleavage planes are independent of the relationships that people had before. So if me and my neighbour, you know, got on well together and we always help each other and so on, and I don't know, his house goes and mine doesn't, or he is eligible for some payment and I'm not, and I feel angry about that, and our relationship breaks down, we still have to live next door to each other, don't we? And it becomes difficult. And so what you see is that these cleavage planes sort of cut across the number one protective factor for any form of physical or mental illness. This has been known now for 40 years in the area of mental health and social research, and that is social support, good social support. This really is the most important resource, and this is what, of course, you people represent, the networks that will help people come together. And there's recently been very important research done by an American academic called Daniel Aldrich. Daniel Aldrich moved into New Orleans just before Hurricane Katrina to take up a job at a university there. And they evacuated. He didn't even take his computer with him. He thought he'd be just over the state border visiting his relatives for a weekend. And he lost everything he owned. And he's done some wonderful research. And what he's shown is comparing all of the communities on the coast of Japan after that big tsunami, the Fukushima tsunami. He says the one factor that predicts the speed and adequacy and completeness, you know, the how fast, how much of the community is reconstructed and how many people come back to these communities, and also the number of deaths, is not the amount of money that's spent, it's not the political influence they have, it's social capital. Social capital measured by people's connection to organisations in their community, preferably self-organising community-based groups of mutual support and assistance. This is the most reliable indicator of recovery. The better connected a community is, the more those organisations, whether it be a flower arranging organisation, that will be a network that can then come into the recovery system and be reconfigured for recovery. And so this sort of social fabric, this recognising and taking care of the social fabric, is the most important thing, because during this period, I call it a process of differentiation. We've got to get from plum pudding back to complex multi-dimensional structure. And if we get in there and start to promote this, recognise different impacts, help people get together and advocate for their needs, help them communicate with each other, pick up tensions and deal with them, then we can allow this sort of separating out and recognition of difference in a constructive way. But most of the time, nobody's got time to think about that. Local governments flat out, state governments flat out, all the various agencies are flat out doing their little bit trying to keep up, and nobody can step back and look at the whole. It's wonderful. Congratulations, Damien, for having me here, talking here before the event. I gave a session to Bushfire Recovery Victoria. Now, this is a new agency that's just been got going, and they had a whole bunch of temporary staff who got things going straight away, and now they've got their longer term staff. And I gave this presentation, and somebody said afterwards, we should have had this the day after the fire. Nobody can listen to this kind of stuff the day after the fire because everyone's in adrenaline mode rushing around. And it's so important just to have a few simple ideas that we've got to keep our eye on the community fabric and take care of it. Because what will happen is we've got two processes of differentiation happening. We've got a destructive differentiation through cleavage planes and conflict and negativity and hostility. And we've got a constructive process of differentiation through planning and getting people together and advocating and organising systems and recognising different needs and creating communication situations where problems can be solved. And that will occupy the recovery process, which will probably be 2, 3, 4 years, 5 years maybe. It's been an observation of mine that in over quite a long period of time that in rural communities, there's often a 40 to 60% turnover in the next 4 years. You know, people leave, you know, and when they leave, it's because they don't feel attached to their community anymore. And probably things have gone wrong with relationships. We also know that most people have trouble getting straight on to rebuilding their houses because they've got to find somewhere to live and keep their job going and keep the kids focused and so on. And you can't turn your mind to very complex problems for some time. But you can if you have people to help you, who can help you think about how to fill forms out and things of that sort. And so in this period of time, of the recovery period from, let's say, a few months afterwards, stretching into whenever you get things finally stabilised, people are in a highly stressed state of mind. And in that state, if they are not actually thinking about taking care of themselves, the risk is they get into burnout mode. They work like mad. After Black Saturday, I remember giving a talk in Strathewen, a little town underneath the King Lake Ranges. Well, it's not really a town, it's just a community. It had very, very severe effects. And I talked about the stress response and the need for people to think in the long term and to do things slowly and steadily. And a woman said to me, I wish my husband was here to hear this because I'm so worried about him. He won't stop working. They'd lost their house. He won't stop working. He's up on the block all the time. He never stops. And of course, he's a man in his late 50s. And she said, we lost our house in the when was it, wouldn't have been 39 fires, but anyway, some fire or another, when I was a child. And my father did the same thing. And he died in the second year of a heart attack. And I can see my husband doing the same thing. Now, I have no idea what happened, but we know that people put their health at risk by allowing the stress and this sort of narrow focus and not realizing that the most important thing is to look after what you can't replace and then replace what you can when you can. So what you can't replace is your health, your relationships, your family life, your career, your relationship with your social networks. If you lose them, there's very serious ongoing damage that will damage the quality of your life. But you can build a house at any time. So better to actually do it slower and more steadily. And this is a really important message we need to get across. It'll come best from people who are in the community who understand that. So now we know that what is enormously helpful is for people to work together, to compare notes. Most people are in a very unusual state. They don't know whether they're normal. And so the moment they hear that other people are in the same state, they actually feel better about it. So let's come to COVID-19 and the isolation process. You know, we've said that it's all about communication. It's all about getting people to work together. We know that the nucleus of the reorganisation of the fusion is to get a community recovery committee going, which represents the community. And that takes time to do it properly, to make sure that all the groups are represented, that the community feel they've had a say in it. After Black Saturday, a number of communities actually invited the Electoral Commission to come in and run an election to actually appoint people to their recovery committee. In the current communities, the recovery committees are just really getting going now because they've gone through a very slow process of making sure that everybody who is interested is able to participate. They work out what shape it needs to be, they draw up a constitution, they work out how they're going to do it, then they go through a process of appointing people into it, and then the whole community say, yep, I'm happy with that. And that then becomes the group that becomes the spokes group for that community, because we know that governments won't get it right without feedback from the community. And governments will have to do a lot of things that they're not familiar with. They're not part of their normal business after a disaster. And if they don't get the feedback from the community, they will come in with the best of intentions, and it won't take account of local knowledge or local circumstances. So the forming of this community recovery committee has to happen as a result of a whole lot of meetings and participation, and then it becomes the nucleus for a whole communication system. But then what happens with COVID-19? Well, we could say in some ways that's it's a particular kind of threat, and there are a number of circumstances that produce a similar sort of threat. This one is of an infectious illness. Another one is of a toxic contaminant. We've had a bit of experience of that in Victoria, whether it be a smoke plume or a toxic substance in the soil. And the third one is radiation. We haven't really had that in Victoria, and may we never. But these are all situations where you can't see the hazard, and at least for a while, you don't know whether you've been affected by it, and you don't know when you're safe. I mean, with COVID, of course, eventually you get sick, but we've seen the way that works with the anxiety about health in Morwell after the fire there. And there's just been an award, hasn't there, on the news earlier this week of a court case that's been ongoing. And people are very clear that they feel their health has been significantly affected by this smoke for a long period of time. And so what we have to understand is that this is a very difficult hazard to deal with psychologically when it's so uncertain, because if you have threat combined with uncertainty, it produces anxiety, because our normal response is to respond to threat by doing something to take it away. We evacuate from the fire. But when we have the possibility of an infection that we can't see, well, what do? Well, the only thing we can do is do what we're advised to reduce the threat. Wash our hands for 20 seconds. you know, to say 1.5 meters away. Well, go into isolation. Now, as long as we harness our sense of isolation to that anxiety, it solves the problem. We feel safe. Well, what happens then? It's very annoying to be in isolation for a long time, unless I think about the illness and then I'll say, no, I feel safe. And now what happens? Well, what's happening in the bushfire area is that there's tension now. People can go and visit there, and the tourist operators really need the money. But many local people are saying, ooh, we don't want any infected people up here. In fact, we feel anxious and unsafe when strangers come into town. We don't want them here. You know, it's very complicated, isn't it? And so what I think has happened is they've actually transferred their sense of safety onto the state of isolation. And now that's their safety. And they don't want that disturbed. And I think we're all going to have to make quite some transition back to ordinary life in different ways. And we need to be prepared for that. So this is threat number one, the illness and how we deal with that. And I think there's a very important communication process. Now, I want to say this, that as a psychologist, what I've learned in looking at emergencies and community process is that in psychology, we're taught that we process information in our brains. It's not true. Well, your brain is important and relevant, but we actually process our information in social networks by comparing what we think with what other people think. And we hear things and take them in and understand them by talking about them. To just take them in, we forget it. But if we have a conversation about it and we get other people's views and we shift our own and we incorporate their information in, we actually incorporate it into ourselves. And so one of the most important things in something like a bushfire is to create opportunities for communities to meet together, to have sausages and discuss things, to have a talk about something and then process it together. And everyone then starts to develop a common fund of knowledge and information. It could be simple information about what's the phone number for talking to DELP about getting trees cut down, through to how do we look after our health, or what's going on with our kids when they have nightmares. And so if we come back to the idea of how do we deal with the COVID threat, well, we have to actually take on the actual information that we need to consider. That means we have to be able to compare it with others and talk about it. And so we have to discuss with each other what it all means. And don't people interminably talk about people, in fact, about COVID. In fact, some people I've been talking to on meetings have said, I'm all COVIDed out, I don't want to talk about it anymore. And other people are full of it and they want to talk. This happens in bushfires too. But so we want people to be talking about it, to process it, but they can't get together. So we've got to do it by Zoom, but not everyone's got Zoom and not everyone feels comfortable with this. So this is a very big challenge. But the point I'd make is this: we're worried about contamination, aren't we? But there are other contaminations that we've lived with for a long time, aren't there? We don't mix sewerage and food, do we? We keep them extremely separate. And we don't think about it, except we have a whole lot of rituals about washing our hands and using the right things to wash our hands when we move from one place to the other. We wouldn't think of going to the toilet and then preparing food. But this has become routinized, so we don't actually think about the danger unless we have an outbreak of E. coli or something. But so we have mastered those threats through familiarity from kindergarten onwards. And what we have to do now is we have to actually see COVID as a new threat that we have to build into our social interaction, new routines and rituals not just washing our hands quickly after going to the toilet, but maybe spending longer and doing it habitually, doing it longer. And we have hand sanitizer in various places. And, you know, after a while, this will become second nature. But it's during this period of transition that the anxiety keeps coming back. So that's threat number one. I think we can deal with it, but we've got to actually recognise the anxiety and respond to it. Threat number two is financial stress. Many people have lost their jobs or suffered serious financial downturn. And I'm not going to talk about that, except we know that financial loss is an enormous stress for people, huge stress. We've seen the government do you know, some pretty heroic things for governments in the way of supporting this. But it doesn't take the problem away, does it? So we've got to think that people are carrying this enormous stress in the background, which makes people tense and much harder to take information in. But the third stress I do want to spend a couple of moments before we, you know, open it up for a conversation is the isolation. Now, I've made observations about this, and I think there are just a couple of points to make on this. The first is isolation means we change all of the routines and patterns of our lives. Now, what I've learned over the 30-odd years I've been working with disasters is that that there are three basic problems. There's the trauma of the day, if you happen to be in a very dangerous situation. There's the loss, whatever you've lost, material, financial, social, whatever. But the third destructive influence is disruption. And I've learned that the disruption of people's lives is incredibly expensive, not financially, but emotionally. For this reason, that we try to develop ordered patterns in our lives so that we can do all the basics without having to think too much about it. You know, we put our pajamas in the same drawer and our socks in the same drawer. We keep our butter and jam in the same place and so on. I remember a woman saying to me when she lost her house in a bushfire, she said, you know, I used to regard cooking the evening meal as my great recreation. It was my sacred time. I'd go into the kitchen and say, leave me alone. I just loved cooking, and it would be my unwinding time, etc., etc. And she said, but after I had to cook meals in other people's kitchens, and I'd be ransacking cupboards looking for a saucepan or something, and eventually you'd find it and you'd think, why the hell would you keep a saucepan in a stupid place like that? And by the time I'd done this in several different places, because she had to move from place to place before they found, you know, I was just over it. It's completely spoiled cooking, you know, and all she suffered is the disruption of her kitchen, you know, and you can imagine how you can multiply that with many different things. Now, so what I've learned is that if we live our lives in a routine manner, the reason we develop routines is to give expression to what's important to us. To see our friends regularly is not just a pleasant thing, it gives us a sense that we belong together, that we greet each other and I feel I'm a nice person because people smile at me. We know that when people you expect to smile at you scowl or ignore you, you know, it's an impact, isn't it? You say, well, have I upset them? Is the first question a reasonable person asks. And if you can't think of anything, or maybe they're having a bad day. But the first question is, have I done something wrong? Or so now, if this structure of routines is operating, we don't know about it, like your knee when you don't have housemate's knee. You don't know about it. It just works. You just walk around and go down the shop. But if you've got housemate's knee, it's a laborious process. And so if you're trying to cook a meal in somebody else's kitchen, it's a laborious process. I won't say it's like going down the shop with housemate's knee, but you know, you've got to actually improvise and invent your daily routines. So when you go into isolation and start working from home, or you can't see your grandchildren or your children, or sorry, not you, well, your children if you're the right age, or you've got your children there all day long and you're trying to work, and you haven't got a routine for working, and they haven't got a routine for studying at home, and everything starts to become full of friction, and you're working hard to try and get everything done. Then what we see is that there's a loss of that space we had in our lives. The traveling to and from. One woman said to me, I've lost the boundary between work and home, because she's working online. She works with very challenging clients. She has a difficult and painful, upsetting phone call, and then she puts the phone call and she walks straight out the door into the middle of the family, but she can't share it with them, but she's full of it. Whereas she said, normally I'd hang the phone up, I'd tidy up my desk, and I'd get in my car or go to the train, and I'd spend half an hour getting home, and by the time I got home, I'd put it aside. So she's lost that structure, so that she's muddled. It's stressful. Interestingly, another woman in that same group said, I've developed a routine for doing that. I have all my work papers and my computer on my table, and at the end of the day, 5 o'clock, I pack them all up and I put them into a backpack and I close it and put it under the table, and I leave it there until 9 o'clock next morning, and then I take it off. So I'm going to work now. So she's created her own little routine, hasn't she? It seems a bit superfluous to actually go to the bother of putting it in the bag, doesn't it? But she's created a routine that is a demarcation. Somebody else said, they actually go and wash their face and change their clothes in some way, and that's their marker. So that I think what's happening, some people are onto it and some people aren't, and they're feeling confused and distressed. And what I notice is that a lot of the spontaneous communication disappears. We can have Zoom meetings, but we don't just chat to each other like we do if we arrive at a physical meeting and we go and get a cup of coffee and we chat to people in the kitchen for a few minutes, and that's where you get a very important lot of information about yourself and your belonging and how people feel about you. And we don't do that. We click on and we do our business and we click off. And so we could call this the informal communication. Actually, in terms of information theory, this is the one thing I remember learning in my undergraduate psychology, is that 80% of communication is redundant in normal circumstances. It's redundant in the technical sense. It doesn't add any new information. If I'm going to ring up Damien and find out what time is the meeting on, what are we up to today? Wednesday. I'll say, how are you, Damien? How's it all going down there in Surf Coast? Have you had, if you had a nice weekend, blah, 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 blah. And if Damien's actually very stressed, he's not wanting all this redundant damn communication from Rob, what's his name? He just wants to fix it and for him to go away so he can get on with his work. We often feel that discrepancy, don't we? But the redundant information that doesn't do anything is actually helping us get to know each other and hold our relationship. And so one of the things I think that's happening in the community at large is that we're losing that invisible fabric of exchange. And one of the consequences is some people, I think, suffer an erosion of their sense of identity. And one way that shows up is they just don't feel right. It feels weird. I don't feel like myself. There's a whole lot of words I've been collecting that people say it seems unreal, weird. I feel invisible. I feel forgotten, rejected, devalued, helpless, lost, misplaced. The days roll into each other. I feel I'm in Groundhog Day. It doesn't feel like me. I feel uncertain. I think this is people struggling to sort of adapt to a new situation. And so therefore, I think that one of the things we have to realise is we need to encourage this informal communication for people during this period. And as we move into to easing up, I think people are going to have a great need to not only start communicating spontaneously, but to be able to process the experience. So if there's one piece of advice I'd give, if you are having book clubs or or any kind of meetings or whatever, suggest people tune in a few minutes early and hang around a few minutes later and just talk about how things are going. And if people wander off the subject, have a look and see if they're processing their experience. And if they are, that's very important for them to do. And maybe let it go for a few minutes before you get on to business. So look, I'll leave it there. We could talk more about all these things, but maybe we'll see if anyone's got any questions or thoughts.
Thanks, Rob. So yeah, we'll open it up for questions now. What we'll do, if you can, on the chat function at the centre bottom of your screen, if you've got any questions for Rob, you can choose Rob's name or even my name and type your question in the chat function, and Rob will do his best to answer it. And hopefully we'll get through a few questions. We don't have unlimited time, so we'll get through as many as we can. So if anything's piqued your curiosity, please type it in the chat function and we'll see if Rob can answer it for you.
I guess something I'd be interested in is, how do these observations relate to your own experience of isolation, and what you observe, in your own networks, your families and your friends and so on. How much difference has it made to your lives?
Hi, Rob. I might respond to that. I'm Bill. I've got to have to say my observation is that as you were talking, so much of it rung very true to the experiences that we've been going through. So really appreciate your insights and how that sort of connected through to the psychology of the situation and what we've been doing, as well as the how it works with a natural disaster as well. And I suppose all of us have been through different periods where they've had to face trauma, and it is quite different this time, not being able to see the danger, but to understand the differences, as you pointed them out, has been really valuable.
Yeah, I suppose to sort of follow through, I've talked about natural disaster, but as though it's a sequence. Now, in the COVID, there's no real starting point, is there? It's just slowly gets more and more worrying, and then we go into these gradual scaling up, and so you've got a debonding process, but it's not an all or nothing like, am I going to die in this bushfire? It's just a slow erosion of the bonds, and the distancing is a really, the bonds are still there in theory, but will the relationships be the same as soon as we can see each other or not? Perhaps some will, some won't, and maybe people need to be aware there's been a sort of an impact on your bondedness, and that probably needs to be repaired or to be promoted in the post isolation period. But then, of course, we might have the anxiety about having big get-togethers, mightn't we? So we'll have to think about how we do that.
There's a couple coming through on the chat, Rob.
Yeah, we've got a question coming up here. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll send it through to you.
Now I've got a few coming up here. In comparison to fire, flood, etc., that has an end date. How will we get to an end date when we will feel safe? How long can people maintain health when anxiety continues? That's right. I mean, they're telling us there might be 2 or 3 waves. There were 3 waves in the 1918 pandemic, and I think the second one was worse than the first one, and so it went over about 3 years. Now it's not the same beast, but we don't really know how this is going to go, and it'll probably depend on how effective our procedures are. But I think these are really important questions. And so let's put it this way. The longer it goes, the more of a psychological challenge it's going to be. And therefore, the more we need to actually be aware of maintaining our health and keeping people, having these networks where people can talk about what's going on. The moment we talk about an anxiety, we can begin to think about it. When it's just going round and round in our heads and keeping us awake at night, it all gets out of perspective. And so the system has become aware of the mental health impacts. But, what I've learned from disasters is that, you might get 10, 20, 30, maybe 40, maybe at most 50% of people will develop a diagnosable mental health condition. 50% would be for horrific traumas like massacres and so on. But even there, 50% of them don't qualify for a diagnosis. And in a natural disaster, it's 80% of people, don't think they need to go and talk to a counsellor because they don't feel unwell. They feel unhappy and all sorts of other things. They're not sick. And that's where community networks come in. And that's where the social support and the social capital comes in, where if people such as yourselves who understand that there is a mental health component to informal social organisation, and they will want to talk to you, members of their community, rather than some shrink that they don't know about. And often what's very helpful is then if you're a community leader and you've got various people coming and talking to you and you're worrying about it, you might get some advice from the professional. And it's really valuable to have local professionals networked in so that you don't carry it all yourself. You debrief a bit and get some advice about what you might say to them. But yeah, I think this is something we have to watch. Okay, what's the next one? How do councillors do to ensure work as a group so that we can bring the community along with us? Councillors in the sense of elected councillors?
Yeah, that's the question, Rob. Yep.
Yeah. Look, I think what's really important for councillors, the value they have is social capital in the sense of connection. Social capital is about relationships and connections, and some of it is about knowing people in the community, but there's a very important dimension of social capital which is going into the power system, being able to actually represent needs to groups that ordinary people don't get access. So I think their ability to be connected with the community and then be the spokesman and to advocate. Sometimes I notice that it's very hard for councillors who are, perhaps political animals, to actually realise that recovery is not a political process, it's a social process. And that it works best when it's outside the politics of the situation. And I think that is helped when the councillors can really see a role for them to play and where the community is able to present to them needs. How important is it that we encourage safe physical socialising, singing, dancing in the streets like we saw in it? Yes, this is where I think the artists in the community are particularly important. Wasn't it wonderful to see all those people singing out in their balconies? Thank goodness we don't all live in little streets with balconies, but anyway. But I wonder how often they did it. But you can imagine you would regain a sense of community and belonging, wouldn't you? So I think inventing that for our geographical environment and coming up with ideas, there are brilliant ideas will emerge out of the community, but people need to know who they can say and who will feed it through. So having a group of people like yourselves linked with Damien so that this idea can go through and not just be a great idea that no one knows about, but can actually be slotted into a strategy that's trying to develop something. Time frame for recovery committee. I think what's important is that it is properly grounded and that the community members feel I've got a stake in this, I'm recognised, my group is part of this. And I think that's the important thing, because what'll count next year is not that it took 3 months to form your community recovery committee or 2 weeks, but that it truly does represent the community, and the community actually is working with that and presenting their issues and feeling that it is representing them. That'll be a tremendous, there's nothing more demoralizing than people feeling they're not heard. And that brings us to the question about listening. As a person who loves to chat, if I understand you right, listening becomes super important. Is that right? Absolutely. Absolutely. Because if you listen to somebody, then you encourage them to talk. And when they talk, they bring stuff from the sort of the pea soup and plum pudding of their mind, where all sorts of stuff is milling around. And they must organise it, mustn't they, to make sense? They must organise it. Otherwise, you say, sorry, you're saying 3 things at once. Let's take them one at a time. And so listening. And I remember when I was working in Christchurch, I went there a number of times, and you know, they were really struggling with their damaged buildings and damaged houses, and there was tremendous effects on the families and the kids. And I was trying to think, how can I encapsulate a very simple piece of advice to families about their kids? And it suddenly came to me that as parents, if you commit yourself to give your full attention to your kids regularly, as often as you can, hopefully for a few minutes every day. But if you can't manage that, then for an hour or so every few days, you know, just sit down, just give them your full attention. Don't have anything organized, just give them your full attention and see what happens. Because that's what we all want, don't we? And I'd say that about your neighbours. Just if they're talking and talking and talking, particularly if they're saying the same thing many times, there's something they're not finding to express. And if they've got a strong grievance or whatever, isn't it a relief? We've all had that experience of actually offloading to somebody. And all you need to do is give them your full attention and say things to make sure you understand. It's called reflective listening. Are you telling me this? You mean that? Gee, what was that like for you then? And what did you do? You know, and so on. Just very simple things. And another thing I would say is, don't as soon if they get to the point where they start crying, you know, talking about their ruined house or something, or their burned house and so on, and they're crying. Often what happens is everyone gets anxious, says, "Oh, geez, you need to see a counsellor." No, they don't. They're crying. They're crying because you're listening to them and they're telling their story. And they're connecting with the whole experience, and the feeling is coming into play. And usually, if you just sit with them quietly and be expressive and be interested, you don't have to get upset too and cry. You just need to be interested in what's so sad. The tears don't last that long. They settle down. They'll often apologise and then they'll go on talking. And they'll really feel different after they've had that experience. But if you say, "Oh, you better go and see a counsellor," no, they're not mentally ill. They're sad. And we need to feel confident that that expressed emotion is never the problem. It's unexpressed emotion that causes problems, that keeps us awake at night, that makes us feel bitter and unhappy. So yeah, listening is a great skill. There's handout material around about constructive listening skills and so on, which I'm sure we can get hold of. From my experience, what do I think the impact will be on young children, both mentally but also developmentally in the long term? Look, I've been looking at, recently I developed, a few years ago, some a training package for children and disasters for people working in the area. As children get forgotten about, but that'll be someone trying to sell me something I don't need, so we'll ignore it. There is a very clear indication from the big research projects that's been done after disasters in the United States is that age is not a vulnerability factor. In other words, children are not more vulnerable because they're younger. They're vulnerable because they don't understand what's happening, that they feel overwhelmed or whatever. And some of the things that predict children having difficulties is negative emotional tone in the household. People being grumpy and irritable, bickering. We've got problems. We're all unhappy. We're all tired. We're all irritable. You know, but actually a very simple strategy people can have is let's hold our good manners, right? So you don't swear and yell at people who say, I'm sorry, dear, I'm not able to help you with that tonight. You know, or say please and thank you. You know, behave like your grandmother said you should. And that will actually, that's the point of good manners, is to oil the wheels of social interaction. It's a very simple thing, to hold manners. You know, a couple can pull each other up and say, hang on, don't speak to him like that. You know, we all need that help. We can pull our kids up. The kids will pull us up if we do this. So negative emotional tone. What's very important also is to let children regress, to go back to an earlier stage for this reason, that if they're at their developmental optimal stage, they're actually already doing new things, trying new things out, running risks, trying to develop new skills. That takes a lot of energy. But suddenly when they get a whole lot of worries about big things, and mum and dad are worried, and we've lost our house, or we can't do this, that and the other, and we don't really understand it, but it's obviously got everyone scared, they're actually going to move back to an earlier stage in their development where everything is automatic and easy. And then they free up resources emotionally, don't they? Because it's easy. They know how to do all this stuff. So therefore, all the spare resources can go into managing the emotions. And what I've observed for many years working with children, back when I was in the Children's Hospital, but has also been proven by some of the big research projects, is if you let children regress, they do much better. And when they're ready, they jump forward to where they should have been. As long as you give them that space to actually, you know, process things and get themselves together. Now, we need parents to understand that and have confidence. And some well-meaning parents will say, just because we've lost our house in a bushfire doesn't mean you don't make your bed. Now you get in there and make your bed, etc. You know, I'm not going to let my kids lose their developmental achievement just because, no, that's not the way to go. Be trusting of them and so on. So we know that kids can do very well, but it's actually a big weight on them. And I think what's really important is to look wherever you can take a bit of pressure off them, which maybe looks like they just don't be as productive. They just play, they just hang out, they just want to talk to their friends on Zoom. This is where they're actually processing stuff. Many businesses will be coming out of hibernation in the coming weeks. How do I ensure productivity amongst employees when they return back to work is at the level it should be? A very interesting point. Now, I would say have a transition plan where you don't expect them to start work on Monday morning and be fully productive. I would think the productivity, what's going to underpin the productivity is the harmony and the social relationships and the feeling that they're belonging and the feeling that they've got an investment in the enterprise and they're going to, you know, put their effort into it. And so there may be a process of rebuilding connections. That doesn't mean you have a party for the first week, but it means maybe have sensitivity to spending a little bit more time allowing people to catch up and have a graded process, depends on the business, but a graded process through to full productivity. And that's accompanied with opportunities to understand these transitions. I sort of think of this isolation as being like a chronic stress state. And when we're in a state of stress, we're in a state of compression and focus. And so in a sense, we're like a diver that's deep down under the pressure of the water. And of course, when divers come up too fast, they get the bends, don't they? They need to come up slowly. So I'd say try to build a process of transition. Now, I know that are we running out of time? What
We've got
time do we
about
have?
another 7 or 8 minutes, Rob. I've just asked for everyone to hold on questions. We've got about 3 or 4 to get through. You'll see them there.
So what time frames? I've gone backwards in my little thing.
I think the next one starts off, it seems to me, the trauma most of us are feeling.
Yeah,
That's the next one.
relates to the threat of a disaster rather than an actual disaster. That's right. It's the threat that is the problem. We were expecting it to be much worse. Yes, there's a sense of limbo. Have we dodged the bullet or just diverted? The big answer is we don't know. That's the uncertainty. But I think the more we actually listen to the facts and translate what's happening overseas, we can see these other countries, they're fed up with being isolated, aren't they? They're still having thousands of people die every day, but they're fed up with it and they're coming out. You know, Russia and America and so on. That doesn't seem to me like a very good strategy. As an old person in the vulnerable age group, doesn't sound to me like a good strategy. And so you can't get people to be rational if they're in a hyped up state. We can get them to be rational if we process the information. And that means networking and discussions and talking and calming things down. Maybe it means joining social media and bringing in rational conversations, learning from the plights of other people. The best recovery mechanism is anxiety. Yeah, as long as anxiety is realistic and reflects possibilities. Yeah, it's appropriate. It's important to be anxious, isn't it? We shouldn't train children, for instance, not to be anxious about disasters. We should pair the anxiety with behaviours. We bring them up to be frightened of traffic and snakes and redback spiders and deep water, don't we? But we tell them what to do about it, and that's what we have to do with this. And we have to do that with ourselves. I reckon there'll be a lot of people who are very anxious about what's happening in these countries where they're coming out of lockdown. But of course, it's also a matter of economic survival. The trauma that most of us are feeling relates to the threat of a disaster. Oh, we've said that already. To Amy's question, has my research identified sub-cohorts that generally fare better or worse than others? And what sort of targeted response have I seen implemented to aid recovery? This comes into the issue of resilience. And just to, I like to tell a story, which I won't tell in detail, about how I spent half a day looking up what the word meant and finding out the Latin roots and looking up a Latin dictionary. And what you eventually come to is that the Latin resile, I think it's called, means to rebound. But the word sile, anyone got any Latin scholars here? Am I in safe ground? It comes originally from the word reeds in the river. And as soon as I saw that, I thought that's the essence of resilience. Reeds flex and deform and go flat when the flood comes, but they don't break, they come back up. And I think the essence of resilience is people who are very clear about what the most important qualities in their life are, and they allow them to flex and deform but not break, so that we preserve our linkages with people. We don't have as much contact, we keep in touch, and we say we're looking forward to seeing you. We hold the core of our patterns to differentiate work and home. We hold the core of our relationship with our kids. We give them time. We can't do all the things, but we'll do it when we, people, studies of resilient people are people who take a very proactive approach to their problems, who preserve a sense of optimism, who engage in active management of their emotions, and some very simple properties like that. So those people do well. And the people who struggle are often people who try to do it by themselves, who are not used to using social networks. The Traders Association, from the Traders Association, what you've been talking about, I'm keen to get different businesses, same sector, accommodation, retail. How can we work together and assist with issues other than topics you think should be raised? But what other topics? I would say absolutely. The more you can get people to feel they're doing it together, the better that is. Pooling information. you know, I think this is a time to put aside maybe the healthy competition that sometimes exists between different businesses in the same area. And in a sense, the big picture is to hold together this cooperation yeah, to actually work out how you can help each other. There will be a whole lot of things relating to specific businesses. And you know what I find in disasters is that people have bright ideas. They work out how to do things. And other people haven't thought of that yet. They will probably get there, but only much later. But if you share those observations, you develop a body of collective knowledge. And there's something wonderful about that body of collective knowledge. So everybody's learnings gets passed on. And I think that's a great way of feeling I'm not alone and I'm not doing this by myself. That's a resilience factor. The role of media, I think the way the media presents it, I object to the media, even the ABC, when they've got an issue, they go and put the microphone in somebody's face who's very unhappy about it. And that's the person they get. So it's an emotional message. Well, I know that some people won't be happy. I don't want to hear that one person is unhappy. I want to hear more information about what's going on and why. So I think my experience, if we get a connection to the local media and we feed them the information that is of importance and value and help them understand that, that's often a good thing that works.
I think we've got two more, Rob. There's more.
Young adults.
Yeah, young adults.
You know, I think this is a very important group. Not everyone in that group is well connected. Some of them are very isolated and lonely. And I think anything we can do to help them network is fantastic. If we're in a bushfire zone, I'd say, is it possible to help a drop-in centre? But maybe some of your groups can auspice some kind of networking for young people, helping them talk to each other. I think just compare notes, even if they do it on Zoom. They're all very familiar with that stuff. They have their romances on Zoom, don't they, from the other side of the world. So, you know, create opportunities for them to network and invite them in, talk about what's going on in the Shire. And another great thing is to tell them that you're interested in their point of view. We want to include that in the planning, to have the young people's voice. Any way we can involve them, I think is very important.
And there's one last one there, Rob, I've sent through. It starts with my experience.
Thanks, Damien. Thanks, Damien. Can you perhaps ask it? I'm not sure I'm going to find it in time.
If you scroll down to the bottom, I think it should appear.
Damien, right. My experience in the community has been consistently good over many different circumstances in my 50 years. Geez, you don't look that old. It must be Zoom, mustn't it? Or maybe I'm too old. The modern crisis seems to have the most frustration outside the close community, mainly government actions or inaction, lack of leadership, possibly through increased media. This is where the social capital sense of linkage to government becomes important. That representatives of Bushfire Recovery Victoria go up and get to know people and attend community meetings will give confidence, and the same for whatever other groups. I think through local government, I think if we encourage you know, state government figures, people from the departments to actually come and just hang out and get to know people. I think this is a very important thing. They don't become just names, they become people. We saw this happening to great effect with Christine Nixon after Black Saturday. She spent so much time as an important government figurehead just going around to communities and listening to people and then following it up. So this is a really important model, I think, to make these relationships personal. Now, we also get the media, not just to reflect the complaints. You know, we get the situation where the ABC, bless their hearts, does a Four Corners on how there are unhappy people in Marysville, and they interview several people who say there's no counselling and my neighbour up the road is suicidal. There were 7 agencies. We all watched it, you know. And there were 7 agencies providing counselling in Marysville. And the people knew who this person was, and they went to visit him the next day and said, "I'm so sorry you're having such a hard time. Can we help?" "No, I don't need it," he said. "It's my neighbour who needs it." The neighbour's already seeing somebody, but he's not actually telling them. You know, and so this poorly organised and over-enthusiastic media coverage, where they're not talking to the right people, they're looking for dramatic stuff. And we've got to get these relationships where they represent the reality, because it's demoralising for the community to feel that the agencies are so incompetent. They're not. They're trying hard. So yeah, I mean, you can work on that slowly now, can't you, guys? That's what your network is about: is developing these relationships and building on them as you go.
Well, thank you, Rob, for all those answers. You got through quite a lot of questions. It was very well done. Thanks to everyone for attending tonight. I think we peaked well over 50, so that's a great turnout. Thank you all for attending. And very much thank you to Rob for joining us with his expertise and insights. I think you gave us a lot of your experiences, and a lot of it was ringing true. I've got a lot of comments here saying, yes, that makes sense to me. And I think people were relating well to the experiences that you were providing to us. We've got a lot of work to do in Surf Coast Shire, both the councillors, staff members and community members, and we're trying to work very hard together through this. And I think your insights have helped us tonight, Rob. So thanks very much for joining us and giving your time.
Thank you very much. It's great to talk to community people like yourselves. I really enjoy meeting them after disasters, but it's great to meet you before disasters as well. If you're interested in these ideas, various groups have put presentations by me onto YouTube, you know, where I've given talks in various places. It's the same body of knowledge, but adapted to different situations. So, you know, that perhaps gives a bit more depth and detail if you're interested.
Great, thanks, Rob. And we've recorded tonight's session, so we'll be getting that up online probably in the next couple of days as well.
Great.
Thanks everyone for joining us. I'll sign out now, and we'll see you again soon.
Okay, bye-bye. Thanks. Nice to talk to you all.